What I'd like to do now is spend a little bit of time looking at what are the main things that our educational system is either not understanding or misunderstanding that comes from the world of biology. And I think the most important thing is meaning. When you're a child, before you get into first grade, what are you doing? You're running around the backyard, everything from eating dirt to beating on pots and pans to looking at bees to leaves. Everything out that you're doing has meaning to you or you wouldn't do it, right? So what is meaning doing? Meaning is driven by or the other way around. Intrinsic motivation and meaning are linked. So when I'm doing something I want to do, it's meaningful and I'm intrinsically motivated to do it. And as long as I'm doing it, I'm getting blasts of neurochemicals. I'm getting blasts of neurochemicals. Dopamine, serotonin, norepinephrine, oxytocin, lots of neurochemicals that are helping me stay focused on and enjoying what I'm doing that's meaningful. These are the chemicals that are driving intrinsic motivation. The fascinating thing about these neurochemicals, what else are they doing? They're driving long-term memory. So your neurochemistry of intrinsic motivation is driving long-term memory. So, what happens when we design a system where we use extrinsic motivation? Extrinsic motivation when we use reward and punishment. When I have to get you to do something, who is it meaningful to? You? No. Meaningful to me. We have none of this chain going on here. We got none of this stuff happening the way we want it to. This is how we learn. This is how we get joy. This is how we get happiness. This is how we get meaning in our lives. This is how we figure out who we are in the world. But what do we do for 18 years? Come here, Bobby. Here's what you're going to do for the next 18 years, and don't lift your head up till you finish. That's what it is. That's what it is. That's what we're doing to our children. That's what would have been done to us. So what happens so you have within you, as I mentioned before, we got genetic variation. We have brain plans that nobody else in the 7 billion people on the planet have. Each one of us is unique. So something is meaningful to us that isn't meaningful to our neighbors, because I'm a genius at something or you're a genius at something that your neighbor isn't, whether it's baseball scores or leaves or whatever it might be. So what happens for 18 years or longer if we never let you self-stimulate your own meaning, which we call it the Advanced Learning Institute, we call it the meaning network. What happens when you can't self-stimulate your meaning network? Do you come out of school knowing who you are or what you care about or what's important? No. I mean, there's some statistic, I have never really seen it, but I'm sure it's out there, that most of the people that come out of college that major in something don't end up doing what their major was. Engineers, nurses, and teachers are probably do, but everybody else I'm not so sure about. Yeah? Yeah. You. Yeah, exactly. Right. Probably all of us. I majored in criminology. What am I doing, right? But here's the interesting thing. The minute we lock somebody in a box and we force them to do something that isn't naturally intrinsic or meaningful to them, they can pass a test, but they don't have the neurochemistry to to remember what the heck was on the test. So from a biological standpoint, the whole educational system is built on a neurochemical fallacy. Here's another interesting thing. The research is tremendous about this. There's a guy named DC that does, I think at the University of Rochester. I think the guy is the smartest dude out there. He really understands this intrinsic, extrinsic motivation stuff. And his research, and Annabelle and a bunch of others, they've done literally, hundreds and hundreds of research surveys on this. What they found was that the higher the extrinsic motivation, really in a way the less learning and creativity that happens. Why? Because when you use extrinsic motivation, what you're doing is, let's go back to this, our brain here. Remember we said you were getting 20 watts? You're getting 20 watts of power, glucose and oxygen through your carotid arteries into your brain. When I'm extrinsically motivating you, if I put a gun to your head and I say, eat Tom's sock or I'll shoot your brains out, you'd eat his sock, right? If I came up to you and I said, I'll give you $1 million if you eat his sock, you might eat his sock for $1 million, right? If I take the reward or punishment away, would you ever repeat that behavior? That's just like children. So you can reward or punish, and people will conform under the reward and punishment umbrella. But the minute the umbrella of reward and punishment is lifted, they revert back to their old behaviors. And this is why 70% of the people that go into prison go back into the prison system. It's just biology. It doesn't really work. Why? When I use an extrinsic motivator, these 20 watts of power tend to go into the lower parts, evolutionary-wise, of our brain, the limbic system and the reptilian system, the reticular activating system. Basically, it goes into lower brain centers. Lower brain centers are notoriously rigid. It's hard to get new learning in those centers. They tend to repeat things over and over and over again that they've always done. They're very rigid. So what happens when I go meaning? When I'm activating the meaning network, I'm stimulating the prefrontal structures, which connects up to the whole brain, which naturally selects in information. So this is why, from a kind of biological standpoint, our system that never asks Johnny what's meaningful to him, is so damaging. So if I'm trying to teach Johnny math, and I'm trying to teach him 2 + 2 or any of those things, I could ask Johnny first. I don't have to change the whole system. Johnny, what do you want to be when you grow up? I want to be a fireman. Okay, Johnny, here's the burning building, here's the ladder. How many rungs are on the ladder and how many rungs do you have to get on to get to the floor where the fire is? He's going to select it in like crazy. And I'll go into a minute, because of the intrinsic motivation. We call it wrapping. And really, this is what the Profound Learning Institute is doing with their educational system and what they're doing at Masters Academy, much more than anybody else. They're understanding that without stimulating intrinsic motivation, without meaning, without driving these neurochemistry up, reducing reward and punishment as the primary leverage point, they're getting more long-term memory, and their grades are up. Aren't you guys up?
400%.
400%. It's just biology. So let's shift here a second, and I'm going to go into selection in a second. Does anybody have any questions on this? So when I am learning something, this is the fascinating thing. In biology, there is no instructive process of learning whatsoever. All learning is selection. What do I mean by that? Okay, what I mean by that is when we look at instructive processes, here's what we think about. I stand in front of you and I say 2 + 2 is 4, memorize it, right? Now, lucky for you, we're all born with a numerical syntax, with numbers and language. You're born right now, if you had a child tomorrow, it would come out of the womb set up to select in every single sound of every language in the world, including the clicks of some African nations. So it's already there. So when you drop that child in with the neurons preset, he selects in the language like that. Matter of fact, the child has 15,000 connections. About the research is up and down and around, but in general. And a lot of times, just so everybody knows, I use metaphors a lot rather than specifics, because your brain will go numb if I get too deep. But basically what happens is you've got neurons that are set up to replicate every language in the world. And when I just put you in an environment, those neurons fire and select in the language and wire up immediately. And that's why kids that that grow up in double language, an African dialect and also English, they can speak them both. Nobody's studying anything. Nobody's memorizing anything. They're selecting in the information. They got 15,000 connections per neuron. By the time we're 18, we got about 5,000 connections per neuron. Any language you learn has to be learned on the existing structures that are in there, because nature wipes out the other 10,000 connections because it says you don't need them anymore. We don't need numbers, we need efficiency. So let's make the 5,000 really efficient. So what happens to you is you then end up with all these brain structures that are hardened. When you try to learn a new language, you sound like Arnold Schwarzenegger. He learned his after he was 11. He came to America. There was a Secretary of State in America named Henry Kissinger. Henry Kissinger came to America after he was 7 to 11. His brother came beforehand. His brother has no accent. He sounds like he's from another planet when he talks, because he's selected in on the existing structures. So all learning is instructive. There's already math in the brain. There's already things in the brain that are in there. So why is this important? Because a guy won the Nobel Prize, Gerard Edelman, for discovering in biology, in immunology, that we used to think that the antibody, everybody knows what an antibody and an antigen is, a disease molecule and the thing that goes against it. So the antibody's the good one. We used to think that the disease molecule came into the body, and the disease molecule said, hey, look at me, and I'll show you how to make your shape. We talk about the antibody attacking the disease molecule. It doesn't really. What happened was the antibody would change its shape to fit it, and it would go out. The body couldn't recognize it, and it would get flushed out of the body. So what he discovered was that it wasn't the disease molecule saying, hey, look at me and learn how to make your shape fit mine so we can go out and we won't kill this guy. What really was happening is that this guy was sending information to him that already existed within him. He already had mump information, measles information, and it's called avidity in genetics, and he might refine what he already had in there a little bit based on what was going on here, the environmental influence, so it could fit better, and that's what vaccinations are. It's trying to get the information in so you can select more, okay? So he's selected in. So this guy was so fascinated by what he discovered. Oh, and the reason AIDS is such a terrible disease isn't there any information? We believe that the AIDS came from animals. Monkeys, we're not sure, but AIDS came. So the humans had no antibodies that were coded for HIV. So when HIV first came in, there was no selection. Everybody died. So that's why we got all these different things that we're trying to save people with, why they can live longer. We figured out a lot. But that's why AIDS was so terrible. There was no selective process going on because this thing had no knowledge. The antibody had no knowledge. It's exactly the way our brain works. Edelman was so excited about what he learned there, he then went into neuroscience and developed what he called neural Darwinism, basically a selective process of learning and memory based on this selective process of antibodies transferred to the brain, which since then we know works throughout the whole of biology. There is no instructive process. So again, from a biological standpoint, instruction doesn't exist. So we're wasting our time if we're standing in front of the room instructing people without understanding what we just learned, right? Without understanding what is what? Meaning. That's right. When meaning is selective, and we know it's selective, then what we have to do is we have to treat those individuals in the classroom as little meaning beacons that our job is to connect with what's meaningful to them. And if we don't, we're going to inhibit their ability to select in information. And since all learning's selective, it's really going to mess up what we're doing. Now, there's another trick we can do, and that is, and that's what Profound Learning Institute is doing, and Masters is doing with their new programs. What they're doing is they're using. See, this is another thing that I said. All learning is selective. Is also discovery. The reason you're somewhat involved with what I'm saying is you're discovering a new way to look at things. You're not memorizing this stuff. You're not doing anything. We have a genetic drive to run around the environment and try to discover new stuff. So this discovery process is important. We got this biological drive to discover. That's really how we like to learn. Oh, look what I found. We love the novelty part. It's biological love. So, but the instructive takes all the discovery, all the meaning out of it. Here's what I'm going to do. Here, Bobby. Here's your head. Here's the knowledge. You're done. The problem is there's a big hole here and it all comes out. And we just keep pouring it back in. My son, I'll never forget, my son studied, I forgot what grade, 4th grade. I had every capital of every state stickered all over the house. You know, he finally, and my kids were not geniuses in the class. They were not made for the classroom. They were my DNA. So I get him to memorize all these freaking capitals. He gets it. He gets an A. He comes back and he says, 7th grade, Dad, I've got to memorize those things again. So I said, okay, son, what's the capital of North Dakota? He goes, where? He remembered 3 friggin' capitals. 3 capitals out of 50. You know? He's a musical dominant. He could like memorize all, you know, any Beatles song, all the what do you call it? The notes, everything. He could hundreds of songs he could do. He can't remember 3 capitals. No meaning. Yeah. And think of the hours and hours and hours we wasted. I mean, I was brain dead at the end of that 3 months. So anyhow, this discovery process is so vital. But when we go into this pouring the information in, we're stealing meaning and we're stealing discovery. And this is what the Profound Learning Institute and Masters is doing. They're putting discovery and meaning back in. And that's what we all need to do. So what is happening in the brain that's making discovery and meaning so much more of a powerful process of learning than instruction? Okay? What is it? What's going on? Well, a guy named Donald O. Hebb, what he discovered that the more neurons that fire in someone's brain, the more learning that happens. We've since come to call this, I believe, the more neurons that fire in your brain, the more learning that happens. Okay? Now, you've heard the phrase neurons that wire together, fire together. Have you ever heard that before? That's a big term that people use because they don't really understand. Even neuroscientists use that, but that's not really what he was saying. Anybody that's really read his works and researched his works, and he had quite a few in good papers. But what he really meant was the more neurons that fire, the more learning that happens. Why? So let's say I've got a neuron. Okay? Let's say I've got a neuron and some information comes into the brain and it's not very important or meaningful information. This neuron will be stimulated at a few points. Okay? But what we found was that so in other words, how's the best way to say this? If somebody was tickling the back of your head right now, Tom, with a feather in your hair so light that you couldn't feel it, you wouldn't turn. Now, if I told you to focus on it, you could feel it. So you would never remember that. But if I walked over with a cinder block and dropped it on your foot, you'll remember it forever. That is, the Hebbian learning rule is the more neurons that fire, the more learning that happens. That's why a cinder block on your foot is going to be easier to remember than wind blowing on your face from the air conditioner up here tomorrow. Okay, and that's a pretty simplistic way to say it, okay? So what drives more neurons to fire? Well, there's another piece here. So, meaning drives neurons to fire. Discovery, as long as it's intrinsically motivated, causes huge numbers of neurons to fire. And the more real the environment causes more neurons to fire. Why? As I walk, so we were set up to learn moving through time and space. Let me get this. Let's go back to the brain. When I'm in the classroom, what's happening? I'm getting those 5% of neurons in the left temporal lobe fired. I walk through time and space. I've got to keep my balance. The cerebellum's firing. I'm moving through time and space. The parietal lobe is activated. I'm moving through time and space. My occipital lobe is taking in, I'm taking in the ricochet of the light from the leaves. I'm taking in the light coming from the sun. I'm taking it bouncing off the earth. My feet, my sensory motor cortex is activated as I walk through the crunching on my ground. I can feel it. I feel the branches rubbing across my arm. So I hear things that are coming in. I smell things in the olfactory lobe. I start smelling things. I'm like doing crazy Hebbian learning. That's why, you remember your first kiss? That's pretty physical. That's the Hebbian learning rule. Do you remember the last test you took? No Hebbian. No Hebbian last test. You ain't gonna remember no last test. Second to last test, third to last test, fourth to last test. You ain't gonna remember that. No Hebbian learning rule. It's a waste of time. So what's happening here is, this is what's happening. When we get meaning, we get discovery, and the more real it is, the more neural firing. Why is this important? I'm going to go a little scientific here. And this is what Hebb found out. When a neuron is stimulated simultaneously at more than 2 points, okay, by other neurons, right? These are other neurons stimulating it at the same time. A plug is blown out of the neuron. A magnesium plug is blown out of the neuron like an explosion. And when that magnesium plug is blown out, calcium rushes into the cell, and you've got DNA in here, right? And it affects the DNA chain and starts to cause an internal change that causes more synapsual buds to grow and more dendrites to grow. You have 1, 2, 3, you have different levels of dendrital growth. So it causes these dendrites to grow. So what are these synapsual buds and what are these dendrital growths? It's learning. So if you're doing something and you're in a classroom and you're only giving somebody a test and you're only firing a limited amount of neurons, you're not getting Hebbian, you're not blowing magnesium plugs out of these NMDA receptor sites, calcium's not rushing in, and the neuron itself is not changing. So what is learning? It's literally physiological change within the neurons and its connections. So we've got an educational system that's not causing the Hebbian learning rule. It's not blowing out magnesium plugs, and it's focusing on too limited a brain area without meaning. Now, it doesn't mean you can't read a book and remember something, firing a limited number of neurons. But if it's meaningful to you, you naturally pre-fire your own neurons, large groups of them. So this is probably one of the most important things that the whole educational system misses. And if we just understand this, we could flip everything.